Hello, my dears, my darlings, and welcome once again to the playgrounds that are very strange. Welcome once again into the haunted abyss that is my mind, that is my channel, in fact, which I like to make a reflection of all of the weird, bizarre contradictions that go on in my own head. Hope I'm succeeding in that. Sincerely hope I'm succeeding in that. One of the problems I have with this podcast is not that I have a dearth of subjects to talk about. It's exactly the opposite. Because it covers such a broad spectrum of things, this podcast is very loose. It doesn't have to cover anything in particular. It's really just about bizarre and disturbing material. It can be anything. It can be absolutely anything. It can be things that happen in real life. It can be fiction. It can be art. It can be media of any kind. It can be absolutely anything. And what crops up largely depends on what I've been obsessing over or what I've been doing in the previous days, weeks, months. Now, this one, I'd really like to talk about, actually. I've been on a bit of a kick recently. I'm not entirely sure why, but I have these periodic obsessions. I believe I mentioned in the last episode that I've been watching a lot of stuff about serial killers. Around that time, lots of documentaries and biographies of various serial killers and rather unpleasant personages, and that has sort of moved on. It's transitioned into something related but different, which is ghost stories, ghost documentaries about hauntings and about possessions and that kind of thing. As someone who was a child in the 1990s, I don't know whether anyone listening out there remembers, but in the mid-1990s there was this absolute explosion of obsession with what I suppose can be broadly termed paranormalism, although that term along with the term supernatural I have sincere problems with. Them. For me, I don't understand how they're defined, because if something occurs, if there is a phenomena, regardless of how bizarre or unusual it is, it's something that occurs in nature. It can be very strange. It can be very disturbing. It can be outside our frames of reference, but it's not unnatural. It's just something that happens, you know? Maybe it's part of a system that human beings don't come into contact with very often, or that we have very little perception of, or something to that effect, or just no frame of reference for. Like, for example, maybe there are cosmological phenomena that we will discover more of the more we explore space and the nature of the universe and so on and so forth. But the term supernatural, it seems to apply parameters that just don't exist to me. It's just something that happens. So let's assume, for example, for the moment, by the way, I'm a total skeptic when it comes to these things. I am the kind of person that people really dislike at parties or at social gatherings, because when people start talking about, oh, they went to a medium and they said this, or they went to a haunted house and they felt that, I'm the one that sort of sucks air through their teeth and goes, well, yeah, I don't know quite why you're saying that was a ghost or why that was a haunting, because it could have been this, it could have been that. Outside of that context, you wouldn't have interpreted that experience in that way. But let's allow for the moment that there is a phenomena, okay? Just for the moment that there is a phenomena. What I find problematic is when people try to apply explanations to it, because those explanations are invariably simplistic and agenda-driven. It's because people so want this stuff to be true. They so want this stuff to be true because even the most horrendous haunting, the most vile, sadistic, bizarre and frightening tale of a haunting or a possession, like say Borley Rectory, for example, here in the UK, which was up until historically quite recently regarded as the most haunted location in the UK, if you like. They provide some measure of hope. The reason being that there is continuation. There is some sort of continuation after death. And I think that's what people are buying into. It's also romanticism. There is a certain romanticism in these stories. There is an automatic mythologization that lends poetry to reality that, quite frankly, isn't there. It doesn't exist. This is a problem with these kinds of phenomena. if it sounds too romantic, if it sounds too poetic or mythological, it's probably not true, or it's probably been simplified down to provide that perspective or to influence that perspective. This is true of lots of things. It's not just true of ghost stories, it's true of anything. If someone comes to you with a personal account of a memory that they have, or something that they saw, or something that they did, and it sounds too simple, it sounds like a fairy tale, it sounds like the morality and the dimensions of it are too narrow and too cartoon-like, then it probably didn't happen as they're telling it. That's not to say that they're liars, it's just that this is our nature as human beings. We mythologize, we narrativize, and also memory. Memory is a fucking awful medium for stuff like, for anything, but for stuff like this it's even worse. And it's not just one study, it's not just a handful of studies, it's every study ever conducted into the nature of memory demonstrates that it is awful for specificity. Absolutely awful for specific detail. And this is not just long-term memory, this is also short-term memory. Our memories are not recordings of things that happen. They are these narrativized, mythologized, bias-driven pieces of artwork. They are only just removed from fantasy in that regard, and a part of what influences their rewriting over the years is agenda and bias and the way we perceive ourselves. We so love to apply very narrow mythological terms to our own personalities, and this is what happens in accounts of ghost encounters, or of, when people went to a purportedly haunted location and experienced this or experienced that. By and large, it's not how they're recounting it. It's not that they're lying, they're not. It's just that that's how the memory has become standardized in their own minds, in its own medium, as a result of how they want to be perceived, and that's a problem. Anything from memory is garbage. It's useless when it comes to determining any kind of fact or any kind of reality. It is absolutely fucking useless. The only thing it really tells you is about the nature of memory, ironically, and the nature of the person who's telling you, the nature of humanity in many respects. And that's what interests me about these things. That is what interests me. It's what it tells us about ourselves, and I find it fascinating. But I've always been drawn to stories of occultism, of supernatural stuff, I suppose, for want of a better term. Things like, people who claim to have been kidnapped by aliens and to have seen UFOs in the sky or to have encountered ghosts. I'm absolutely fascinated by it. And the worst of it is I am of the ilk that I sincerely want them to be true. I do want there to be ghosts and hauntings and demons and things all around us. I just don't believe there are. That's a division, a definition that is very important to make, I feel. I would really love there to be magic. I would really love for there to be things like entities, unseen entities all around us that are influencing reality, but I just don't believe there are. I don't see any good reason to believe there are. And I am not of the ilk that will allow want or desire to affect my perceptions of reality. I just allow for the possibility. However unlikely it is, and I find it to be very, very, very unlikely. I mean, one of the big problems for me is that whenever I get someone talking to me about ghosts or hauntings with any degree of authority, it's always prescribed, it's always stuff that they borrowed from other people, and they never, ever, ever define the mechanisms. They never, tell me, well, how is it that these things can operate without any kind of physical substance? How can they affect reality? How can they maintain coherence without any kind of physical form? The mind, as abstract as it feels at times, is a physical thing. It derives from physical mechanisms, and without the brain to cultivate it and to allow for it, how does the mind even exist? What system is there? What is there? What anatomy do ghosts have? What is it? What state of being is it? And they never, ever, 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 ever fucking tell you. And they can't, because there's nothing to examine. It's a narrative exercise. It's an exercise in projecting narrative onto reality, and that's a problem for me. It's a problem for me as a lover of stories, and this is a really cool thing I find when you are familiar with stories, particularly stories that are as specific as ghost stories or fairy stories or whatever. You get to learn the narrative patterns. You are able to distinguish between what is fantasy, what is story, what is myth, and what is actual reality, because they all have different patterns, they all have different rhythms. The rhythms of a story are very different from the arrhythmic, poetic nature of reality. Waking reality doesn't have poetry. It doesn't have rhythms and coincidences in the same way that stories do. Or it very rarely does, and even when it does, it's a matter of application. It's not something that's external, it's something that we perceive because we are naturally pattern-seeking entities, you know? It's why we see faces in everything, it's why we see faces in the grains of wood or in fire. It's a noted psychological phenomenon, faces in the fire. It's what we are psychologically evolved to recognise for very survivalist reasons, you know? Very brute, very organic, very real reasons. But I love the nature of it. I love ghost stories. I love it when people tell me their accounts. I don't get angry about it. I love them. I think these stories are fantastic because they are so interesting, and I love to put myself in a mindset where I can get a shiver from them, where I can get some sensation, some emotion from them. I, like everyone else, if I go to a location that has a particular reputation or a particular atmosphere, I love to get that shiver up my spine. You can't help it. No matter how skeptical you are, you can't help it. There is a part of your brain that has that sincere doubt, that kind of aches for it to be true. And I get it as much as anyone else, and I love it. I absolutely love that sensation. That creeping chill up the spine, that sort of paranoia when the lights go out, you know? Absolutely love it. But when it comes to determining the reality of the situation, I would want more absolute evidence than just a feeling, I'm afraid. Because feelings are just no use in this analysis. They're absolutely no use. What they are fun. For me, it's the same as going on a ghost train ride for me, going to a haunted location or a purportedly haunted location, getting involved with like ghost walks and that kind of thing. I used to do it all the time. When I lived in Derby, which is just up the road from where I live now, I used to go on the Halloween ghost walks around the town on Halloween night because they were great fun. They were great fun. Everybody is a little bit drunk, everyone's a little bit scared and anticipating things to happen. So what happens is that the tour guide, who was usually the historian Richard Felix, would lead you down into the cellars of, say, the Dolphin, which is a purportedly haunted pub in Derby, and suddenly someone would get a drip on the back of their neck, or they'd hear something like a gurgling pipe, and then everybody would be screaming, and it's great fun. You feed off of one another's fear, you feed off of one another's reactions, and I love that. I love the communal atmosphere of it, but I'm not swayed by it. I'm not swayed by that kind of reaction. I want to see, you know, what I would want for me to actually throw up my hands and say, oh yeah, absolutely, it wouldn't be a matter of belief. It would just be, oh yes, I've experienced this. I don't know what the experience was, but I've experienced this. It would have to be a full-on manifestation and not a fucking orb or some nonsense like that. It would have to be a full-on manifestation of a ghost. It would have to be a spectre of some sort. And even then I would be rather skeptical, because seeing is not believing, regardless of that ridiculous saying. Seeing is not believing, because what we see can be deceived. Our minds can be deceived by various things like drugs, like conditions like encephalitis, by potential aneurysms. The mind can be manipulated into seeing things through lack of sleep, through suggestion. Suggestion is so fucking powerful. You can get people to do anything by suggestion. You can get people to believe absolutely any fucking thing. Well, look at the power of the industry that's built up around this nonsense. You know, people who proclaim to be psychics or mediums or whatever. It's absolute wankery. It is total bullshit. I mean, they are frauds. They are total frauds. They may not believe that they are. They may believe that they're doing something genuine. They're not. They're not. They are total fucking frauds. And that phenomena I have no time for. I have no time for whatsoever. Primarily, I mean, there's lots of reasons why I fucking hate that nonsense. One of which is that they trample all over the memories of people's relatives and they prey upon people's bereavement, and that's leech-like and disgusting. But the thing I hate about it most is that universally, the perspective they provide on a potential afterlife is picayune and narrow and simplistic and ridiculous. It's ridiculous. It's like a Disney film version of what the afterlife might be. Now, assuming that for the moment, just assuming there is some sort of continuation of conscious existence, forget the fact that there's no defined mechanism for that. Forget that it's almost impossible. Forget that. But just assume that there is for a moment. Why would it be so fucking simplistic? Why would the continued existence, and the notion of an afterlife, by the way, is silly anyway. If there is some sort of conscious continuation, it's just more life, it's just more existence. Why would it be as simplistic as that? Why wouldn't it be as complex and as ambiguous as this condition now? So all of this bollocks about, oh, they're very happy. Fuck off, no one's ever very happy. No one's that simplistic. People are not cartoon characters, okay? And not only that, why would they communicate just to tell you that? And why are they communicating through this fuckwit? Why won't they just communicate with you directly? It makes no sense. Why wouldn't they tell you, like, oh my fucking god, there is a continuation of existence and you won't believe what it's like? Why don't they come back and tell you that? Huh? You know, it's never that, is it? It's always, oh, they're very happy. It's this consoling sentiment, and it's for us. It's for the living. It's for the living to console themselves. It is not anything to do with the dead or death. And referring back to last time, by the way, we were talking about death and whatnot last time as a phenomena. Now, death, for me, holds very little fear. As a concept, it holds very little fear. A cessation of conscious being is not a problem for me. And it shouldn't be a problem for anyone. It shouldn't be a problem for anyone because it doesn't matter. You are just going to stop. And that's it. You won't care one way or the other. You're not going to be like lamenting the fact that you're not consciously there anymore because you're not going to be there anymore. There's going to be nothing to lament. In many respects, it's kind of a relief because there must come a point when consciousness itself becomes a burden, no matter how hale and hearty you are, no matter what technology might provide. I mean, maybe in the decades to come, medical technology or transhumanist technology will allow us, or genetic manipulation will allow us to remain 20 years old forever. But even then, can you imagine just having to wake the fuck up for like 500 years, for 1,000 years, to having to wake up to engage with reality, to perceive your existence? It would be maddening. There must come a point where consciousness becomes a fucking burden, where you've just had enough. And in that regard, for me, it holds no fear. And I think this is the key difference. This is the key difference. For me, when people die, they die. And that's it. That's it. And it's not necessarily a terrible thing. I might mourn their loss because they're not around anymore, because I can't engage with them anymore, because I can't talk to them anymore. That's what I would mourn. I would mourn the lack of them. But that's it, not the absence of them. I would not trample all over them, basically, over their memory, by allowing some con artist piece of shit to reduce them in that way, to reduce their natures in that way. This is the problem for me. It's a problem with sentiment. I fucking loathe sentiment of that kind. I think it's wicked. I think it's disgusting. And I think it actually does us all a disservice. Now, you may feel it to be contrary, but I adore ghost stories. I absolutely adore them. I write ghost stories. I adore reading them. I adore watching them. I will go and find documentaries on hauntings, on haunted houses. I will happily watch and listen to people's accounts of hauntings and of ghosts and of demons and all sorts of things, because I find it narratively interesting, mythologically interesting, not interesting as a measure of reality or of any kind of physical existence, because I don't think it's there. I honestly don't think it's there. If it is, great, wonderful. I would love to experience it at some point, and I mean really experience it. I would love something I can ratify, something that goes beyond just, well, silly feelings, basically, just beyond, oh, I felt a bit of a cold chill there, or oh, I feel like someone's watching. Well, so what? You can induce that situation by watching a horror film in your own living room or in your bedroom, or by turning all the lights off after watching a documentary on hauntings or whatever. You can make yourself paranoid, and that influences the way you perceive stimuli. So it's always stuff like, in any other context, you wouldn't find to be that significant, like pipes clanging or something. Oh, that there was a funny noise in that room. So what? So what? You don't automatically then say, oh, it must be a haunting. It must be a ghost wandering around. That's silly. That's absolutely silly. I have no time for that. I've no time for it. And this is, I'm sure, I've no doubt some of you out there now are sort of bristling at that, because I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen. People don't like having these narratives punctured or questioned, because they become part of the individual. They become part of your personality. People weave them into their sense of self-definition, which is why they're so beloved. They become an artifact almost of religion in that regard. So any attempt to just mildly criticize the possibility of the purported haunting or phenomena becomes a personal attack, rather than a criticism, just a mild criticism of events or of purported events. And that's why the reaction against this kind of criticism is so strong. It's why it's so virulent. It's why it's so fevered and unpleasant, and why people like me are kind of, you're regarded as a skeptic, that horrible word. You are the one who's taking the life out of the party, unfortunately. You are the party pooper. Even though you're not doing anything, you're just calling into question something that is patently unreasonable. Patently unreasonable. And just not allowing yourself to be deluded. You're not allowing yourself to be swayed by what is ultimately insufficient. Anecdote. It's just not good enough. It's just not good enough. But yeah, ghost stories I absolutely fucking adore, and I've always adored them. I've always adored them ever since I was a kid. I would be rapt sitting and listening to people's accounts of phenomena that they have experienced, or that they claim to have experienced, or whatever. Absolutely rapt, and I would seek them out. I remember wandering around my junior school with a big book. It was the A to Z of British ghosts, which I would just flick through and read accounts of the various hauntings through the UK, of which there are many. By the way, there are many, because, of course, the UK has a very long history. There are lots of manor houses and castles and, old manses and things that have such histories attached to them. So, of course, there are accounts of ghosts and all sorts of things. I mean, just up the road from where I live now, there is a story that on certain nights of a summer, around this time, actually, you can see, you are purported to be able to see a Roman legion walking down there. The ghosts of a Roman legion. But because the road was lower back then, you can only see from sort of their waists up. That's one of the things that people experience, purportedly. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I find it fascinating. I find it fascinating in terms of what it tells us, about ourselves, in terms of our desire to be self-mythologized, our desire to have some greater romance in reality than what we otherwise perceive. And in that regard, it's kind of redundant. Which you learn if you start to look at things like, for example, cosmology. If you start to look at, say, quantum physics or stuff like that, there are genuine mysteries. The universe itself, reality itself, is weird and wacky enough. It doesn't need these extra layers added onto it. But I do love them as artifacts of the abstract. My own imagination works in this way. My own imagination has a very mythological bent. It adores mythology, and it self-mythologizes all the time. It tells stories all the time. There's hardly a second goes by where there's not some new image or new concept cropping up in my mind. But that doesn't make me prone to being what I suppose you could call a believer. It just doesn't. In fact, it's had the opposite effect for me. Exposure to stories, so many stories, the stories of M.R. James, of Henry James, of Edgar Allan Poe, of Lovecraft, of King, of Barker, of all of these wonderful, wonderful writers, has it's inured me, it's inoculated me to a certain degree. Because what I see when someone starts describing something that's too narrative, that's too much like a story, something in my mind goes, that doesn't sound like reality to me. That sounds like something written. That sounds like something you would see in a film. And that's largely what's happened, I believe. That's largely what's happened. It's someone who is not lying. No. That's not the case. It's way more complex than that. It's way more complex than that. It's that they have maybe had an experience that they've interpreted in a particular way as a result of social conditioning, because of exposure, because they want it to be that way, because it gives them something to tell, it lends them some degree of romance, and they have continued to tell it. And as they've continued to tell it, it's become reinforced in that manner through the lens of that interpretation, and it's just become more mythologized and more mythologized and more mythologized until it's become the absolute truth in their minds. That's the nature of these things. That's the nature of stories. That's how they happen. I find myself, because I acknowledge this, I find myself in a constant flux, particularly about past memories, particularly about memories from childhood. But yes, I find myself in a kind of flux when it comes to my own memories because I don't trust them. I don't trust them, particularly when they're particularly romantic or when they are very vivid. If they're particularly vivid, then I have a real problem with them. But I adore the penchant of memory to be painterly, to create something that is vivid and is sort of romanticized and exaggerated, but is not a record of reality. You get it where people get it most when they think of memories of childhood. Memories of childhood tend to be massively romanticized, and I mean ridiculously romanticized. They tend to be just too colourful, too sun-drenched, too pure, too pristine. And whereas if you could somehow contrive to go back to those events and watch them from the outside, you would find that they're very different. You would find that they are very different from what your memory tells you. But that doesn't make them useless. This is the point. This is the point I would make with regards to ghost stories and any kind of mythology for that matter. This does not make them useless. In fact, it makes them more. It makes them something way more interesting. It makes them something way more profound. It makes them artifacts of ourselves. It makes them stories which are sacred. It makes them stories. It makes us our own gospels. It means that each and every one of us is a contrivance of various stories and mythologies and exaggerations that can be rewritten if we so want. They can be rewritten. The things that we consider to be sacred to ourselves or to be absolute in ourselves are not. Even the events that influence their creation are not absolute. We are these strange changeling masses of distortion and hallucination. We are hallucinatory by our very natures. We are big walking cathedrals. We're works of art in that regard. And that's why stories are sacred. It's why I adore these kinds of stories and why I love to hear people tell them, even though I might disagree on how they promote them or how they interpret them. I understand, I get it, I get why they tell them with such passion and why they want to believe them to be physically true, even though they're not, even though they aren't. They tell them something about themselves that is psychologically true, that is true in the abstract, which is much more real. It's much more real than any notion of an external reality that we might delude ourselves into thinking that we operate in. But it's also why I love fictional ghost stories too, and it's why I consume them to the nth degree. To the nth degree, I will glut myself on ghost stories and stories of demons and possessions and whatnot. Possessions to a lesser extent. Possessions I find difficult, particularly when it involves demonic possession. I know a lot of people's favourite film is The Exorcist. The Exorcist is held up there as one of the icons of horror filmmaking, and I can see why. It was significant contextually in the time when it occurred, and it's a very well-made film. It's a very well put-together film. But I have a problem with it. I have a sincere problem with it for the same reason I have with most films about possession, and that is I don't understand why the possessing demon is doing what it's doing. It doesn't make any sense to me. If you listen to the demon in The Exorcist, for example, Pazuzu, as it is revealed to be in later installments of the franchise, Pazuzu, it's clearly intelligent. It's clearly an intelligent and imaginative entity, and yet it busies itself with this ridiculous, grotesque carnival. It makes no sense. If you watch The Exorcist, outside of the way it tries to frame itself, then what Pazuzu does whilst it's inhabiting the body of Regan, who is just a prepubescent girl, it doesn't do anything that terrible. Really, what does it do? A few grotesque parlor tricks. The worst thing that happens in The Exorcist is when the elderly priest dies in the presence of Pazuzu. And it's not even clear that Pazuzu killed him. He was already on heart medication. He probably just had a heart attack and that was it. That's the worst thing that demon does. Beyond that, it's just parlor tricks. It is ridiculous, grotesque, and disturbing, but it's just parlor tricks. It's not like it's doing anything that terrible. And I have to ask, if I were in Pazuzu's presence while it was possessing Regan, if I was in Damien Karras' position, my first question would be, well, what's the point of this? I mean, why not possess a pope or a president and do something really horrendous? Do something truly horrific with your time. This is silly. This is a carnival act. It doesn't mean anything what you're doing here. Not only that, but the possessing entity is way more interesting as a character than the little girl. What do we know about Regan, really? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She is almost a blank slate. Before the demon inhabits her, she's basically nothing. She's just a little child archetype, and that's it. When the demon possesses her, she's suddenly interesting. And that's a story I don't know whether it's been written or not, but it would be very interesting to tell, where maybe the guardian of the possessee, or the husband or the spouse, or maybe the exorcist that's called to deal with the situation, starts to realise that they find the demon, the possessing entity, far more interesting, engaging, and maybe even attractive than the person that it would otherwise be. That's an interesting one. And that's universally true, by the way. When Regan is possessed by Pazuzu, she's interesting. When she's not, she's not. And that's fascinating, isn't it? That's a tension that's not always played with, and certainly not very clearly. I would love to see that. I would love to see the film or the story, or maybe I'll write it at some point, that deals with that concept. Otherwise, I find possession films a bit silly. I find them a bit silly. Unless there's some mechanism within the mythology or some explanation for why they're doing it. I mean, maybe they have to do it. Maybe they have no choice in doing it. I can, for example, take the demons in The Evil Dead far more seriously, because they don't really have a choice. They're sort of called by the incantation, and that's what they do. It's their natures. And also, what they do is way more profound. When they get possessed, they hack people up. They cause carnage when they get possessed. That makes sense to me. Whereas the demon in The Exorcist, not so much. Not so much, particularly given that, unlike the demons in The Evil Dead, which are just like they're lunatics, they're sadistic lunatics, the demon in The Exorcist is not. It's intelligent. It talks to Karras. It talks to him in lots of different languages. It tells him things about itself, about the world, about the metaphysics of reality. It's a clever entity, and it's an imaginative entity, so it doesn't make sense for it to be acting the way it does. But yeah, possession films can be problematic for me. They're because they do tend to follow the format of The Exorcist. And when they follow the format of The Exorcist, they become a diluted version of The Exorcist, which is no good. And they also just don't work. They're a bit silly. to be perfectly frank. It just doesn't work for me. I also dislike exorcism films when they're derived from real events, like, for example, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which is derived from a real case in which a priest convinced the family of a girl who they claim was possessed, who wasn't, who had all sorts of psychological problems, to stop taking her antipsychotic medication, and as a result, she died. In that instance, there's a clear-cut case of how the supernaturalism actually causes actual harm to people. And the film of The Exorcism of Emily Rose comes down on the side of the priest, and I fucking hate that. I fucking hate that. He deserved way more than he got, quite frankly. He should have been sent down for life. He really should. It's disgusting to me. And that morality, that moral dimension, I find to be problematic as well. For me, one of the best exorcism films is The Last Exorcism, which I believe is an Eli Roth film, which is unusual because I don't like Eli Roth very much. It's good, right? Because what it does is it actually comes down on the skeptical side. Apart from the last 20 minutes, shut the film off after everything is done and dusted, and when the investigators are driving away. That is a perfectly satisfactory ending to that film. It's perfectly satisfactory, but if you carry on with it, there's an extra 20 minutes where it turns everything on its head, and it turns out there is a demon and there is a cult, and it's like, I hated that. I could have shrieked when I saw that, because I liked the film up until that point. Up until that point, very well shot film, unusual take on the notion of possession, and a very, very sort of anti-horror film ending where there isn't anything supernatural. There is just a very, very disturbed group of people feeding off one another's fear and paranoia, and also conscious con artists. Let's not forget that potential. Lots of conscious con artists out there. But unfortunately, the film gets cold feet. It gets cold feet and throws in this additional 20 minutes as a sort of sop. It's almost as though they're afraid of getting blowback. You can see that the film they wanted to make is The Last Exorcism, the one where it's totally skeptical, where there is no actual supernaturalism occurring. And that's the fact they didn't allow that to be made is really frustrating to me. On the other side, you have the likes of Ghostwatch, which you may have heard me talking about before. Ghostwatch is one of my favourite horror films. It's one of my favourite horror films. Very obscure. Very, very obscure. Ghostwatch was a project in 1992, the Halloween of 1992. Giant Halloween prank by the BBC, in which the writer, Stephen Volk, and the director, and a lot of other people were involved. They decided to create this faux documentary, which was going to be aired on Halloween night as though it was live action, as though it were a live investigation into purportedly the most haunted house in the UK, which doesn't even exist. It's number so-and-so Foxhill Drive. Doesn't even exist. But it's based heavily on the Enfield poltergeist, on the case of the Enfield poltergeist, which is another one that fascinates me. Again, nothing conclusive from the Enfield poltergeist. It's just interesting because of the number of people who still proclaim there was something supernatural and weird going on. That's unusual. That's interesting to me. But Ghostwatch is a fantastic watch. It's a fantastic bit of work because it genuinely convinced people that it was real. People genuinely believed it was real. It was a phenomenon here in the UK. It caused a furor. The BBC got a record number of complaints as a result of it, and as a result, buried it for years. It's only recently that it's got some because people remember it fondly. People of my age who were kids when it was on remember it very fondly because we loved it. We thought it was great. Especially kids like me who liked horror films and whatnot. We thought it was wonderful. But apparently people were so scared. They were so scared they didn't watch until the end. Because if they watched until the end, they'd have got it. They'd have realised that it's just a contrivance, that it's actually a sort of jape. It's a sort of holly jolly horror film dressed up like a documentary. But what people reacted to in that, what I find fascinating about that, is not just the nature of the show. And by the way, it's a very good bit of work. If you can get it, you can get it on DVD. Go get it. It's really well worth watching. It's very sophisticated in many respects. As a horror film, as a piece of fiction, it's very sophisticated. But what I find fascinating is what the reaction to it tells us about humanity. Because as the writer Kim Newman pointed out at the time, there was this amazing media backlash against Ghostwatch. There was this massive cultural backlash against it, and calls for the BBC to be, to hang its head in shame because of what it had done. And people proclaimed that it was because they were scared. It was because they were disturbed. Frankly, bullshit. It's not because they were scared. That wasn't what they were reacting to. If you look at the news from around that era, the documentaries they were airing, there's loads that was way more scary in real life that was happening. It's not about being scared. What they were reacting to was the fact that the show deliberately called into question their relationship to media. It's because it was, it's Auntie BBC, it had Michael Parkinson as the Holly Jolly host, who's a bit avuncular, who we trust, What Ghostwatch did is what a lot of good media does. It calls into question the audience relationship to the media, and it lied to them. It marketed itself as being a documentary, and it wasn't. It told them lies, and it made them react to the lies. That's what they hated. It actually dragged into the harshest limelight how disturbed and how twisted and neurotic our relationship to our media is, because we trust it and we're skirt clinging. It was like, the reaction is as though a parent lied to us. That's what the reaction was about. That's what they didn't like. And that's why it's so good. Because it is an entirely skeptical bit of work. It reels you in as the audience. It pretends it's real. It gets you believing that it's real. And then it says, oh, actually, I'm not. No, you've been had. You've been flim-flammed. That's why people hate it. Now, for me, I love it when media tricks me. I love it when media pulls that kind of joke. Very few of you will find very few examples that deliberately try to market themselves as real. The Blair Witch Project is another good example of how that works. The reason being that people don't like it. People react against it so negatively because they get invested, they get involved, it reinforces something for them, and then it's taken away, it's undermined. It makes them feel foolish, it makes them feel attacked on a personal level. I love that. Personally, I absolutely fucking love that when media does that to me. It's if media tricks me into thinking that it's something that it's not. It's this whole thing I was talking about earlier. You know how the token skeptic is always treated, when it comes to ghost stories and accounts of ghost stories, is treated with disdain and contempt. That's why. It's the same phenomena. That's what you were getting with Ghostwatch on a national scale. And it's amazing, isn't it? It's absolutely amazing. I find that whole phenomena fascinating. The readiness with which people surrender themselves to narrative. And you need that. You need to be able to do it to a degree to enjoy fiction. And fiction is essential. You absolutely need to be fed fiction in order to survive, in order to develop, to cultivate yourself as a human being, to evolve beyond your current contexts. You need fiction in one form or another. And you need to surrender to it. In order for it to work, to have some effect on your mind, you need to be able to sustain disbelief. You need to actually be able to switch off that critical part of your brain that consistently tells you this is not real, this is not real, this is not real, this is not real. Because you need that emotional engagement. That's how fiction works, that's how media works. However, because we're so imperfectly evolved, because we have such issues with our perceptions of reality and our sensory systems are crap, quite frankly, very often it's taken too far. Very often we over-narrativize, we over-mythologize, we see patterns everywhere where there are none to be seen. We project the patterns. They tell us more about our inner worlds than they do about the outer world. It's why I love ghost stories like Henry James' Turn of the Screw, which was also adapted into the wonderful film The Innocents, old black and white film, well worth checking out. And also The Others, which is not as good, unfortunately. The Nicole Kidman film The Others is an adaptation of The Innocents, which is an adaptation of Turn of the Screw. In the Turn of the Screw, what you have is a story that builds itself up like a ghost story. It has all of the beats and all of the rhythms and all of the phenomena of a ghost story, and then turns out to be something else. To be something else entirely, and something way more disturbing. Way more disturbing than a ghost story. But it tells us about why ghost stories occur. It tells us about how we weave them around ourselves. The Babadook is another good example, actually. The wonderful independent film The Babadook has this a seemingly supernatural entity, but which turns out to not be. It turns out to be something else. I love that. I absolutely love that, where the psychological, the natural, and the supernatural kind of commingle, and you get the influencing of reality, the reshaping of reality. Absolutely love that. Absolutely love it. Because it tells us something about what we are. That point where the abstract, the metaphorical, and the actual cannot be discerned, where the barrier dissolves. I think that's wonderful. I think that's absolutely wonderful in narrative terms and in mythological terms. Ghostwatch does it very well. Henry James's stories do it beautifully, as do M.R. James' ghost stories by and large. In M.R. James's ghost stories, there is something supernatural often. There is a ghost often, but it's more about what the protagonists are doing and how what they're doing in their lives. The ghost is almost an expression of that. It's very sophisticated. The supernatural phenomena become an expression of entirely natural circumstances. It's almost as though it's very like poltergeist accounts. It's as though something about the person who is being haunted, if you like, is projecting or contriving this phenomena. And that's really cool. That's really interesting. I love that. I love that very, very much. But yes, I mean, I hope that people enjoy this. I hope people are listening and they're not sort of bristling and they're not sort of getting reactionary about it. This is just my perspective on these things. What I would really love to see down in the comments below is your own accounts. I would love to see your own stories of phenomena, things that you've heard, things that you maybe experienced yourself. I would love to know. So, and also the ghost stories that you enjoy. Please tell me about the ghost stories you enjoy. I would absolutely love to know about that. And any documentaries, please. Any documentaries you might be able to recommend about ghost stories, because I love it. I love that stuff. I love it to bits. I will be very, very happy about that. I really will. But I think I've rambled on for long enough in this episode. I don't know what the next one will be about. I may have a guest next time, ladies and gents. I may have a guest. Who knows? Who knows? Until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!